Today, in more than 125 cities across 41 states, Americans are marching against data centers. The first coordinated national protest against the AI buildout in U.S. history. And the anger has plenty of fuel. In Georgia, the state's largest data center drew some 30 million gallons of water before anyone built it. And in West Virginia, one construction site has now flooded the same neighborhood twice. We begin with something that has never happened before in this industry. Today, in more than 125 locations across 41 states, Americans are gathering for a coordinated national day of protest against data centers. The demonstrations, organized by the advocacy group Humans First, stretch from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Spartanburg, South Carolina, with Texas, the country's data center leader, hosting 17 protests all by itself. Organizers say their mission is to protect hometowns, wallets, and ways of life from projects negotiated in backroom deals. And the numbers explain why it's resonating. Gallup polling finds 70% of Americans don't want a data center in their own community. And researchers at Data Center Watch estimate $64 billion in projects have already been blocked or delayed by local opposition. What began as scattered zoning fights is now a national movement. Part of what's fueling that anger surfaced in Georgia. Fayette County officials investigating complaints about low water pressure discovered something remarkable at the QTS campus outside Fayetteville, the largest data center in the state, a 6.2 million square foot giant on 600 acres. 2 water lines were feeding the site outside the county's billing system, and one of them alone was eventually billed for more than 20 million gallons. In total, roughly 30 million gallons flowed before anyone was charged a dime, and the county sent QTS a bill for $147,000. The county has since softened its accusations, saying a smart meter changeover left some meters untracked, and QTS insists the water went to dust control and concrete work during construction. Once operational, the company claims, the campus will use just 9,000 to 12,000 gallons a month through a closed-loop system. Neighbors whose taps slowed to a trickle remain skeptical. When these fights escalate, they increasingly end up in court. But this time it was the developer doing the suing. And the developer who lost in San Diego. Judge Cynthia Freeland threw out a defamation lawsuit that Sebastian Rucci and Imperial Valley Computer Manufacturing filed against public broadcaster KPBS and reporter Corey Suzuki over coverage of a proposed data center in Imperial County. Rucci claimed the reporting on the project's water use and environmental review omitted key facts and cast him in a false light. The judge disagreed, striking the complaint under California's anti-SLAPP statute, a law built to shut down meritless suits that target free speech, and noting that none of the information in the articles was actually incorrect. Rucci says he plans to keep pursuing legal action. For now, the ruling stands as a warning to the industry. Suing the journalists who cover your project can backfire badly. In West Virginia, the conflict isn't playing out in hearing rooms. It's washing into living rooms runoff from the Monarch Compute campus construction site in Mason County flooded the Meadowlands Estates neighborhood on July 11, sending water and mud across yards and into homes. The second flood since construction began this year. Monarch had added silt fencing, double barrier rows, berms, and new drainage paths after the first breach in May. The storms overwhelmed them anyway. State regulators have now issued an enforcement order halting work in part of the site's drainage area until stormwater controls are rebuilt and pass inspection. And Monarch is going further. A voluntary buyout program for the neighborhood, with roughly 30 homes already in process, paying the highest of 3 independent appraisals plus a premium. When a data center starts buying up the neighborhood it flooded, the stakes are no longer abstract. And now Washington is stepping in. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has ordered the nation's grid watchdog, NERC, to write the first-ever mandatory reliability standards for what it calls computational loads. Data centers, AI campuses, and crypto mines. The deadline is December 31st of this year. Regulators didn't act on a hunch. NERC has documented multiple grid disturbances in which massive data center loads caused or contributed to instability on the bulk power system, including incidents where facilities suddenly dropped hundreds of megawatts of demand in an instant. The order also requires a registry that brings large computational load operators directly under the mandatory reliability framework, with a second phase of standards due next spring. For an industry that has largely operated outside the grid rulebook, the message is unmistakable. If you're big enough to destabilize the system, you're big enough to be regulated. Local governments aren't waiting for Washington. In Southport, North Carolina, the planning board voted unanimously this week to ask the city's aldermen for a 15-month moratorium on data centers. Remarkable, because no project has even been proposed there. The board had been drafting a zoning amendment to regulate data centers. But residents pushed back hard, asking why an outright ban wasn't on the table. Rather than pass the amendment, the board chose to freeze everything while a proper zoning framework is built from scratch. And Southport isn't alone this week. In Leon County, Kansas, commissioners stopped accepting permit applications entirely and directed their attorneys to draft a 6-month moratorium of their own, with a vote expected within days. Across the country, town by town and county by county, the default answer to data centers is quietly shifting from yes to not yet. Yet despite that regulatory wave, construction is pressing forward and getting bigger. Crusoe and Lancium have announced a 1 gigawatt AI data center campus in Childress, Texas, a panhandle town of about 6,000 people. The grid-connected campus will rise on 270 acres owned by Lancium, which secures the land and the power interconnect while Crusoe designs, builds, and operates the data center. The same playbook the pair used in Abilene, where they energized their first buildings within a year of breaking ground and have since expanded that campus to 1.2 gigawatts. Construction begins in the third quarter of this year, bringing thousands of construction jobs and more than 100 long-term positions to Childress County. The design leans on closed-loop, non-evaporative liquid cooling to protect scarce panhandle water, plus behind-the-meter solar and battery storage to soften its draw on the Texas grid. And the financial machinery behind this build-out keeps finding new ways to sidestep the grid entirely. Which brings us to our kicker. Private credit firm Industrial Development Funding and Oaktree Capital Management have agreed to invest $1.7 billion to deploy Bloom Energy's solid oxide fuel cells across Nebius's AI data centers in the United States. Bloom will supply dedicated behind-the-meter power under an off-take agreement the two companies signed back in May, with IDF acting as lead developer on the project and Oaktree taking a minority equity stake. Nebius says it chose fuel cells for one reason above all others: speed to power. In a market where waiting years for a utility interconnection can kill a project outright, a billion-dollar bet on generating your own electricity is no longer exotic. It's becoming the business model for the entire AI build-out. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. It helps us cover more of these stories.